The wind came low out of the desert that evening, carrying the smell of mesquite and dust, old smells, bitter as memory. Cade Laramie rode through it like a shadow astride a darker one, his hat pulled low, his poncho drawn tight against the chill. The sun was sliding down behind the red mesas of the New Mexico territory, throwing long fingers of light across the land, a dying fire over a world long past saving. He was a man who had ridden too long with ghosts. They said he'd once been a soldier, a man who'd fought at Shiloh, Chickamauga, and places so forgotten even the buzzards wouldn't land there. Some said he'd been a scout for the Union Army, others that he'd turned gun for hire when peace came too late for him to care. Truth was, no one really knew. Cade didn't talk much, and when he did, the words came like the last drops out of a dry canteen, slow, measured, and without taste. He carried a Colt Peacemaker tied low to his hip, the metal worn smooth where his hand had rested 1,000 times. It was more than a weapon. It was the only thing that still obeyed him. He had no friends, no home, and no memories worth keeping, just the endless stretch of land that never forgave, and a trail that led nowhere. By the time he reached the edge of civilization, a half-dead mining town called Trinity Flats, the sky had turned black and full of cold stars. The saloon lights glowed weakly through the dust, and a piano was playing something broken and slow. Cade tied his horse to the post outside, dusted off his coat, and walked through the bat-wing doors without a sound. Inside, the room quieted some. Men turned to look, miners, drifters, one or two with the nervous eyes of cow thieves. Cade's boots clicked slow across the boards, each step marking a distance from the man he'd once been. He ordered whiskey, drank it, then another. The barkeep didn't ask his name. In towns like this, questions were a form of suicide. Cade leaned on the counter and stared at his reflection in the cracked mirror behind the bar. The face that looked back was carved out of old stone, sunburned, scarred along the jaw, eyes cold as river ice. Not old in years, but older in the way war ages men from the inside out. There was no softness left, no trace of mercy. He'd buried those things long ago, somewhere between Tennessee and hell. A couple of ranch hands nearby started talking loud about a horse theft north of the river, about some outlaw gang called the Merrow Creek Boys. Cade's jaw tightened. He knew that name. Once, years back, he'd ridden with them, back before he learned that loyalty was just another word for dying for someone else's greed. He didn't care to hear more. He finished his drink, tossed a coin on the counter, and walked out into the wind again. The desert met him like an old friend, rough and endless. He slept out under the stars that night, his saddle for a pillow, and dreamed of things he'd rather not. A woman's voice maybe, soft and far away, a battlefield sky gone red, then nothing. When he woke, the sun was pale, the land empty. He rode on. The next days passed the way they always did, long, dry, and without reason. He crossed arroyos that cut the land like old wounds and passed herds of cattle scattered thin along the valley floor. Every man he met looked half dead, working hard just to stay that way. The West was no place for comfort. It was a place where men either hardened or broke. Cade had long ago chosen the former. He came upon a burned-out homestead 2 days later, charred beams, a wagon wheel lying broken, the earth still smelling faintly of smoke. He dismounted, crouched, and sifted through the ashes. Bullet casings, boot prints, the work of raiders, probably Mexican bandits or Brogan's men. The ground told its story in silence. Cade stood there for a long while, hat in hand, before mounting up again. He didn't bury the dead anymore. He'd stopped doing that after the war. But something in him tightened as he rode off, something like a knot that wouldn't come loose. He told himself it was just another crime in a land full of them. Still, he didn't look back. By sundown, he reached a fork in the trail. The left path wound down into the desert, wide and safe. The right one led up toward the mountains, rough country with bad memories. He studied the tracks in the dust. Hoofprints, wagon ruts, fresh. Something pulled at him then, faint and unexplainable, like a whisper carried on the wind. He took the mountain road. It was near dusk when he saw smoke again. Thin, white, curling up from a cluster of cottonwoods ahead. Another town maybe, or just a camp. His horse snorted as they crested the ridge, and below lay a settlement nestled against the river. It was small, maybe a dozen buildings, a church spire, a mill. On a wooden sign at the edge of the trail, half faded from sun and rain, were the words, Willow Bend. Cade reined in, staring down at it. Something about the name hit him sideways. Gentle, almost too gentle for a place out here. He could see smoke rising from chimneys, hear faint laughter from somewhere near the church. He hadn't heard laughter in a long time. Not the real kind. He told himself he'd just ride through, pick up supplies, keep moving. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But as he descended toward Willow Bend, the sound of a woman's voice drifted across the still evening air, soft, singing an old hymn, carrying notes that didn't belong in a place so rough and tired. The voice was pure, untouched by the world he knew, and something deep inside him stirred. He shook it off, muttering to himself, and rode on. The people of Willow Bend turned to watch as he passed through the main street. Men paused mid-hammer at the blacksmiths, women stepped back from water barrels. To them, he was just another drifter, dusty, armed, dangerous. They'd seen men like him before, and none of them had brought good fortune. He dismounted outside the small general store. An old man eyed him from the doorway but said nothing. Cade tipped his hat and went inside. Shelves lined with canned peaches, bullets, and Bible tracts. A strange combination that somehow fit the place. He picked up what he needed and turned to pay, but froze halfway to the counter. Because behind it stood a young woman, barely more than 20, her hair the color of summer wheat, her dress plain but clean. She looked up and smiled at him, not the cautious, fearful smile of the frontier, but something else entirely. Honest, open. Her eyes met his without flinching. "Evening, mister," she said gently. "You look like you've come a far way." Cade stared for a moment before finding his voice. "Far enough." "Well," she said, still smiling, "then you'll need a good meal. Supper's being served at the church hall. You're welcome to join us," he wanted to refuse. He always refused. But something in her tone, kind, not pitying, unsettled him. "I don't mix well with church folks." "You don't have to mix," she said simply. "Just eat." And before he could argue, she turned to wrap his supplies, humming that same soft hymn again. Cade paid, tipped his hat, and stepped back into the street, his chest tight with something unfamiliar. He told himself it was nothing, just fatigue, just hunger. But as the sound of her voice lingered in his mind, he knew it wasn't. It was the first crack in the armor he'd built around his soul. He mounted his horse and looked once more toward the little church at the end of the street. The sun had dropped behind the hills, painting the sky blood red. Somewhere inside, the girl's voice lifted again, light and sure against the dying light. Cade Laramie rode on into the dusk, untouched by love, but not for much longer. Morning in Willow Bend came slow, wrapped in the hush of dawn and the scent of river wind. Cade Laramie woke beneath a sycamore tree on the outskirts of town, the saddle still under his head, his horse cropping grass nearby. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge, and the air carried that peculiar stillness that only the frontier could hold. Quiet but alive. Waiting. He sat up, rubbed the sleep from his eyes, and reached for the flask by his boot. Empty. That was fine. The whiskey had stopped helping long ago. He splashed some river water on his face instead, feeling the sting of cold on his skin, and wondered why he hadn't ridden out during the night. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the girl's voice that had drifted out from the church window, clear as mountain water, soft as mercy, Clara Mayfield. He'd caught her name in passing at the general store, whispered by the old-timers sitting outside with their pipes. Preacher's daughter, they'd said. Lost her ma to fever, spends her days tending the sick and feeding whoever's hungry. Folks said she was too good for the world she lived in. Cade figured that was a dangerous thing to be. The West didn't have much patience for goodness. By noon, he found himself back in town anyway. Told himself it was for supplies, coffee, cartridges, maybe a new bridle. Truth was, he didn't know what he was looking for. The place felt different in daylight. Children chasing a dog near the well, women hanging laundry, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing like a heartbeat. It wasn't much of a town, but it breathed. That was rare enough. As he walked past the church, the doors were open, and he caught sight of her again. Clara kneeling near the altar, arranging wildflowers in an old tin vase. Sunlight fell across her hair like gold dust. She looked up, saw him in the doorway, and smiled without surprise, as if she'd known he'd come back. "Well," she said, rising to her feet, brushing her apron. "You didn't ride on after all." "Still might," Cade said, his voice low. "Just need a few things." "I see." She folded her hands. "A man like you carries more than a few things already." He frowned. Meaning? Meaning, she said softly, that sometimes we pack our burdens heavier than our saddlebags. Cade didn't answer. He wasn't used to talk like that. Words that cut quiet and clean instead of sharp and cruel. She didn't press him. Instead, she picked up a small basket from a pew. I was just on my way to the widow Parker's. She's down with lung fever again. You could walk with me if you've got no quarrel with kindness. Cade almost said no. Almost. But something in her manner, steady, fearless, made refusal feel like cowardice. He gave a single nod. Lead the way. They walked the dirt path out toward the edge of town where the houses thinned and the prairie began again. The widow's cabin sat crooked among wild sage, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the air was thick with sickness and old quilts. Clara set down her basket, mixed herbs in a tin cup, and coaxed the old woman to sip. She moved with a patience Cade hadn't seen in years. Gentle hands, quiet voice. No fear, no disgust, no self-pity. Cade stood by the door, hat in hand, feeling out of place. He'd faced bullets, fire, and death without flinching, but watching her tend that dying woman made his chest ache in a way he couldn't name. When they stepped back into the sunlight, he said, almost against his will, "You do that for everyone?" Clara shrugged lightly. "As many as I can. Out here, the good Lord's got too much land to watch over. Someone's got to help," he grunted. "That kind of thinking gets folks killed." "Maybe," she said with a faint smile. "But I'd rather die believing people can be better than live thinking they never will." Cade stared at her for a long moment. Her eyes didn't waver. He'd met women hardened by loss, women who wore grief like armor, but Clara was different. There was no armor, just faith, raw and stubborn. The kind of faith he'd once seen in soldiers before the war had taken it from them. They walked back to town in silence. The wind carried the smell of bread from somewhere near the church. Cade's stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. Clara noticed. "Come to supper again tonight," she said. "No hymns this time. Just stew and bread." "I don't fit in with your kind of people." "My kind?" she asked, amused. "The praying kind." Her laughter was soft, unmocking. "Then sit with the eating kind instead." He didn't promise, but that evening found him there anyway, at a long wooden table lit by kerosene lamps, surrounded by townsfolk sharing what little they had. Clara ladled stew into his bowl, poured him coffee, and asked nothing in return. He ate in silence while she spoke quietly with the others, the sound of her laughter weaving through the room like a balm. For a moment he almost forgot who he was, but peace never sat easy with him. He caught himself glancing toward the door every few minutes, waiting for trouble. It always came. It always found him. When supper ended, he stepped outside, the night cold and clear. The town lay hushed under the moon, and from the church came the faint sound of Clara's singing again. A hymn about mercy and the weary finding rest. Cade stood there listening, his hand resting on the gun at his hip, as if it could protect him from what he was feeling. He didn't notice the two strangers watching from the alley. Rough men on horseback, faces half hidden by shadow. They studied him, muttered something, then rode off into the dark. Trouble, sure as sunrise, was heading their way. Next morning, Clara found him repairing the fence near the well, something he'd started doing without being asked. "You planning to stay a while?" she asked. He wiped sweat from his brow. "Didn't say that." "No," she said, "but you're fixing things." He leaned on the post driver. "Old habit. Can't stand seeing what's broken." "That's a good habit to have," he shook his head. "Not always. Sometimes fixing things just gets you more to lose." Her smile faltered a little at that. "You've lost a lot, haven't you?" "More than I care to count." "Then maybe it's time you found something again." He looked at her, the sunlight in her hair, the steadiness in her gaze. For a heartbeat, he wanted to believe her, to believe there was still something in this world worth finding. But men like him didn't get that kind of mercy. Not twice. Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats thundered down Main Street. Riders, 5, maybe 6, dust rising behind them like smoke. The Marrow Creek boys. Cade's blood went cold. He recognized the tall one leading them, Eli Brogan. The past had found him just as it always did. Clara saw his face pale. "Who are they?" "Men I used to ride with," he said quietly. "Men you don't want to know." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve. "Then maybe it's time you show them who you are now." Cade said nothing. The air had gone still, heavy with the promise of violence. He could hear the laughter of the riders as they entered town. could feel old instincts stirring in his bones, the ones that told him to draw, to fight to survive. But over the sound of it all, he heard something else. The echo of Clara's voice from the night before, singing about mercy in a merciless land, and for the first time in a long, long while, Cade Laramie prayed. Not for victory, not for forgiveness, just for enough strength to be the man she thought he could be. The Marrow Creek boys rode into Willow Bend like a dust storm, loud, mean, and hungry for trouble. 6 of them in all, their coats flapping like black flags, their laughter rough as gravel. At their head rode Eli Brogan, tall in the saddle, his red beard catching the light, a silver revolver gleaming at his hip. He looked like a man who'd killed so often he'd forgotten the first time he did it. They came slow down Main Street, the way wolves come on a corral of sheep, easy, deliberate, no hurry. Men stepped back into doorways. Mothers grabbed their children. Even the dogs went quiet. The only sound was the creak of saddles and the wind whispering through the dry grass. Cade Laramie stood near the well, one hand resting on the post he'd been mending, the other low by his belt. He hadn't moved yet. The sunlight burned across his face, hardening the lines there, but inside him something colder was stirring, something he'd hoped he'd buried long ago. Eli spotted him first. "Well, I'll be damned," Brogan called out, grinning like a man who'd found a ghost. "If it ain't Cade Laramie. Thought you were rotting under some mesquite tree by now." Cade said nothing. The townsfolk's eyes shifted between them, sensing the charge in the air. Clara was standing by the church steps, her apron still dusted with flour, her face pale. Eli swung down from his horse, spurs jingling. "Never figured you for a preacher's town type," he said, walking slow. "Heard you left us after Tucson." "That true, Cade? Just walked off one night and never looked back?" "Something like that," Cade said evenly. His voice carried like the click of a hammer drawn back. Eli chuckled, glancing around at the frightened faces. "You folks know who you've been feeding and praying over? This man here's killed more men than you've got pews in that church. He's one of us. Or was." He turned back to Cade. "You see, boys," he said to his gang, "once a wolf, always a wolf." Cade's jaw tightened. He didn't move, didn't flinch, but inside anger burned slow and deep. "What do you want, Eli?" he asked. "Same thing I always want," Brogan said. "Money, food, a few warm beds for the night. You tell these good folks to be generous and maybe we'll leave them standing." "No deal," Cade said. Eli grinned wider. "Still got that spine, huh? Always did like that about you." His tone darkened. "But don't make me break it." The silence that followed was heavier than gunmetal. Then Clara's voice broke it, steady, clear, carrying from the church steps. "You can take what little food we have," she said, "but you'll hurt no one. Not in this town." Eli turned to her, eyes narrowing. "And who might you be, sweetheart?" "Clara Mayfield. My father's the preacher here." Eli's grin turned slow and cruel. "A preacher's daughter. Well now, that's a rare sight." He started toward her, but Cade moved. Fast. One step, one motion. His hand shot down, and before Eli could blink, Cade's gun was drawn and cocked, the barrel leveled square at Eli's chest. "That's far enough," Cade said. For a moment the world stopped breathing. Eli stared at the gun, then at Cade, his grin fading. "You gonna shoot me in front of all these nice church folk, Cade? That'd look real holy." "I'll do worse if you touch her." Eli looked at him long, then laughed, slow and dark. "You've gone soft," he said. "All that killing and you end up guarding hymn singers. Hell, I almost pity you." "Don't," Cade said. "You ain't man enough to." The two men stood facing each other, the years between them thick as smoke. Cade could feel the eyes of the whole town on them, the fear, the tension, the quiet prayer in Clara's gaze. Finally, Eli spat in the dust and motioned to his men. "We'll take what we need and ride out tomorrow. You got my word?" "You don't have a word," Cade said. Eli's grin came back, thin and cold. "Maybe not, but I've got guns. You remember that." He turned to his men. "Grab the stores. Take what you want. Leave the girl, and for now." Cade didn't holster his weapon until the last of them had ridden off toward the stables. The townsfolk began to breathe again, though no one spoke. Clara came to him slowly, her eyes wide. "Why didn't you stop them?" she whispered. "You could have." "Not without getting half this town killed," he said. "Men like that don't bluff." "They burn," she swallowed hard. "Then what will you do?" Cade looked toward the horizon where dust still hung in the air from the outlaws' horses. "Wait," he said. "And when they come for more, I'll be ready." That night the town was quiet, too quiet. Lamps were doused early, windows shuttered. Cade sat alone outside the livery, gun across his knees, watching the stars blink cold above the desert. The crickets had gone silent. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried. He thought of Clara, the steadiness in her eyes, the way she'd stood up to Brogan without trembling. She didn't know what men like that could do. She didn't know the world he came from. He envied her for that. The door creaked softly behind him. Clara stepped out, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale in the moonlight. "You should be sleeping," Cade said without turning. "I can't," she said. "Neither can you." She hesitated, then came to stand beside him. "You and that man, you've fought before, haven't you?" He nodded. "Too many times. Once he saved my life. Once I almost took his. We were soldiers of a sort after the war turned us loose." "Why did you leave him?" "Because he stopped fighting for anything worth saving." Clara was quiet a moment. Then softly, "You didn't." Cade's jaw tightened. "Don't be sure of that." The wind stirred the dust between them. He felt her eyes on him, saw the way the moonlight caught her hair. There was a calm about her that frightened him more than any gun barrel, because it made him want something he'd long since forgotten. "Tomorrow," he said finally, standing. "They'll come. When they do, you get everyone to the church. It's the only stone building in town. Stay low, stay quiet, and you? I'll deal with Brogan." Her voice trembled, but only a little. "You can't face them alone." "I've been alone my whole life," he said. "Don't stop me now." But she stepped closer, her hand catching his sleeve. "Cade, you don't have to be alone anymore." He met her eyes, saw the warmth there, the kind of belief that could melt a frozen heart. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Then he reached up, gently removed her hand from his arm and whispered, "Go on inside, Miss Mayfield." She lingered a moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the church, her steps light in the dust. Cade watched her until the door closed behind her, then looked back at the horizon. Far out, under the rising moon, he saw the faint flicker of campfires, the Marrow Creek boys, making ready. He drew a deep breath and tightened the strap on his holster. The time for running was over. The shadow he'd been fleeing all his life had finally caught up to him, and this time he meant to stand his ground. The dawn came red as rust over Willow Bend, the kind of sky that warned men to keep their guns close. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of gun oil and fear. Cade Laramie stood outside the livery, checking his revolver one last time, the movement slow, practiced, calm. Every cartridge gleamed like a promise. Across town, behind boarded windows and prayer-whispered doors, the people waited. Mothers kept children quiet. Men gripped old rifles, their hands trembling more from dread than age. Inside the church, Clara Mayfield led them in a prayer so soft it sounded like breathing. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady as faith itself. Cade looked once toward the church steeple, faint smoke curling from the chimney. He could almost hear her voice through the wind, not words, just the tone of it. It steadied him in a way whiskey never could. Then the horizon began to move. 6 riders, dark against the rising sun, rode down from the hills in a slow line. Dust rose around them like a storm. At their center rode Eli Brogan, long coat billowing, rifle resting easy across his saddle horn. The Marrow Creek boys came hungry for blood, and this time they weren't here to trade words. Cade mounted up, his horse stamping the ground. He rode out to meet them alone down the dirt road that split Willow Bend like a scar. When they saw him, the laughter started, hard and ugly. "Well, look at that," Eli said when they drew near. "Didn't figure you'd stay to die, Cade." "Didn't figure you'd still be running from ghosts," Cade replied, voice quiet, deadly even. Eli spat into the dust. "You always talk too much." Cade's hand hovered near his gun. "And you always pulled too slow." The 2 men stared across the space between them, the wind whistling low through the mesquite. The others shifted in their saddles, restless, uncertain. They'd seen Cade Laramie draw before. They'd seen what it looked like when death moved that fast. Eli sneered. "You can't save this town, Cade. You never could save anything. Not your men, not your woman, not even yourself." The words hit like bullets. Cade's jaw clenched, but he didn't bite. He let the silence stretch until it hurt. "You talk too much about the past. Cade said finally. Maybe it's time it ended. Eli's grin was sharp as a knife. Agreed. Then everything happened at once. The crack of gunfire split the air, sharp and sudden. Cade moved faster than sight, the Colt flashing in his hand, the first shot taking one of Eli's riders clean out of the saddle. Another wheeled, firing wild. Cade ducked low, fired twice more, the second man falling hard into the dust. The town erupted, men fired from windows, bullets tore through shutters. The Marrow Creek boys fanned out, circling, shouting curses that echoed against the walls. Cade's horse screamed and reared as a bullet grazed its flank. He swung down, hit the dirt rolling, came up firing. Smoke thickened. The air burned with powder. Every sound blurred into chaos. The hiss of bullets, the cries of the wounded, the roar of horses. Through it all, Cade moved like a machine. Precise, deadly, cold. He'd been built for this, forged in war and regret. Every shot he took counted. Every move had meaning. He fought not for glory, but for something he didn't understand. The memory of Clara's voice, her hand on his sleeve, her faith that he could be more than the gun he carried. Eli came down off his horse, rifle in hand, stalking through the dust. "You think you can stop me, Cade?" he shouted. "You think one good deed washes away all the blood behind you?" Cade fired, missed by inches, dove behind a wagon. The bullet splintered the wheel beside his head. "Maybe not," Cade called back, "but it's a start." He rose, fired again, caught Eli across the shoulder. Brogan staggered, dropped to one knee, snarled like a wounded bear. "You always were faster," he spat. "But not smarter." From the corner of his eye, Cade saw one of the outlaws creeping toward the church, a bottle of kerosene in hand. Match ready. His blood ran cold. Clara. He didn't think. He moved. He broke from cover, sprinting down the street, gun blazing. His first shot hit the man square in the chest before the match could strike. The bottle shattered in the dirt, flame licking harmlessly at the dust. "Cade!" Clara's voice cried from the church steps filled with terror. "Behind you!" He spun, too late. Eli's bullet caught him high across the ribs, spinning him backward into the dirt. Pain flared white-hot through his side. The world tilted, blurred. Eli walked toward him, bleeding but grinning, revolver raised. "Always knew it'd end like this," he said. "Just didn't figure it'd be for a woman." Cade coughed, blood at his lips. "It ain't for her," he rasped. "It's because of her." He lifted his gun. Both men fired at once. The echo rolled down the valley like thunder. Then silence. When the smoke cleared, Eli Brogan lay face down in the dust, his gun just inches from his hand. Cade sat slumped against a post, breathing hard, hand pressed to his wound. The townsfolk began to emerge slowly, men with rifles still trembling in their hands, women clutching their children. The Marrow Creek boys were either dead or gone, their horses tearing off into the desert. The battle was over. Clara ran to Cade, dropping to her knees beside him. "You're hurt," she whispered, her hands slick with his blood. "I've been worse," he managed with a weak grin. She shook her head, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. "You saved us." He looked up at her, those eyes like morning after a long, dark night. "No," he said quietly. "You did. You gave me a reason." Her hand brushed his cheek. "Then stay, please." He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But he knew what men like him brought. Trouble, death, sorrow. The West had no mercy for drifters who lingered too long. "Can't," he whispered. "Not yet." "Then promise me something," she said, her voice breaking. "Promise you won't forget that you're more than your past." He tried to smile. "I'll remember, long as I've got breath to." The sky above was wide and endless, the sun burning clean through the last of the gunsmoke. Cade leaned his head back against the post, feeling the pain ebb, the world turning quiet. Somewhere behind him, the church bell began to ring. Not for death, but for life. He'd given this town peace. Maybe not forever, but enough. And for the first time since he could remember, that felt like enough for him too. 3 days after the gunfire faded from Willow Bend, the wind carried peace again. The smoke was gone. The smell of blood washed away by rain that came soft and steady from the mountains. The town was alive, quiet, and healing. The scars of battle, broken windows, shattered fences, bullet-chipped walls, stood as reminders that evil had passed through, but not stayed. And somewhere in a small room behind the church, Cade Laramie opened his eyes. He lay on a narrow bed, wrapped in clean sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and ash. Bandages crossed his ribs, fresh and white. His side ached like fire, but the pain told him something simple. He was still alive. The door opened softly. Clara stepped in, carrying a basin of water and a folded towel. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon, her eyes tired but bright. When she saw his eyes open, she smiled the way the sunrise does after a long storm. "You're awake," she said. Cade tried to sit up and winced. "So it seems." "Don't you dare move," she scolded gently, setting the basin down. "You'll tear the stitches. I just finished patching you back together." He chuckled, dry and low. "Didn't think you'd be the one to mend a man like me." Her hands paused in the water. "Why not?" "Because I've broken more than I've built," he said. "Most folks learn to stay clear of my kind." Clara wrung out the cloth and began to dab at his forehead. "You're not your kind," she said softly. "You're yourself. A man who stood between us and hell. I don't care what you were before." Her touch was gentle, but her words carried weight. Cade looked at her. Really looked. And something inside him shifted. Something old and rusted that had been locked away for years. "I've been called a lot of things," he murmured. "Never been called a man worth saving," she smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time someone did." Outside, the sound of hammers and voices filled the air as the townsfolk rebuilt what the fire and bullets had taken. Children laughed again in the street. The world was moving forward, and for the first time in a long while, Cade didn't feel the pull to ride away from it. But still, he knew the road was calling. It always did. By the time he could stand, word had already spread. The Marrow Creek boys were done for. Their reign ended at Willow Bend. Some said Cade Laramie was dead. Others said he'd walked into the desert to find redemption. Only Clara and the preacher knew the truth. He was healing. Quietly, in the shadow of the cross, one evening, as the sun went down over the valley, he stepped out behind the church, shirt open at the collar, ribs still sore but strong enough. The sky blazed gold and red, painting the world in fire and peace all at once. Clara was there, hanging a line of washed linens to dry, her dress moving soft in the wind. He stopped, watching her. Something about the way she moved, calm, sure, unafraid, made him forget for a moment who he'd been. "You planning to just stand there?" she asked, smiling without turning. He grinned. "Didn't want to spook you. I've seen you stare down a dozen guns," she said. "You don't scare me, Cade Laramie." He stepped closer, boots crunching softly in the gravel. "Then you're the only one who doesn't." She turned, eyes meeting his. The light caught her hair like a halo, though he knew she wasn't any saint. Just a woman who chose kindness where the world offered cruelty. "You'll be leaving soon," she said quietly. He looked down. "Figured you'd know." "I do," she said. "Men like you don't stay long anywhere." He sighed. "Ain't much good at staying." There was a pause long enough for the wind to shift and carry the sound of the river. "Then promise me something," she said, stepping closer. "Wherever you ride next, don't go looking for ghosts. Look for something worth finding." He nodded slowly. "You already gave me that." Her hand brushed his, a touch so light it felt like forgiveness itself. "And you gave us something too," she whispered. "You gave this town a future." Cade took a breath, the kind that felt clean all the way down. "Never thought I'd find mine here," he said. "Maybe you did," she said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, and of all the words they didn't need to say. He wanted to tell her that she'd saved him from more than bullets, that she'd torn down every wall he'd built between himself and hope. But he knew saying it out loud might break the spell. He reached for her hand, held it for a moment. "You ever need me?" he said, voice rough with truth. "Just light a candle in the window. I'll see it." She smiled through the shimmer of tears. "I believe you." Then she rose on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. Soft, brief, real. "Go find peace, Cade Laramie," she whispered. "You've earned it." He turned toward the open land, the sun sinking low behind the hills. His horse waited by the fence, saddled and ready. The same road that once meant escape now looked different, like a promise instead of punishment. He swung up into the saddle, tipping his hat low. "Take care of him for me," he said. "I will," she answered. "And you take care of you." He nodded once, then touched his heels to the horse's flanks. The animal moved forward, slow at first, then steady. He didn't look back, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew that if he did, he might never leave. As he rode out past the edge of town, the wind carried the sound of the church bell once more. Its echo rolled across the valley, gentle and sure. Not a call to arms this time, but to life. Cade lifted his eyes to the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the rest of his story. A story not of blood and vengeance, but of mercy. He was still a warrior, but not untouched anymore. The West stretched endless before him, wild and free. Behind him, the woman whose kindness had disarmed his soul stood in the fading light, watching until he vanished into it. And though no one ever saw Cade Laramie again, the people of Willow Bend told their children stories about the quiet gunslinger who rode alone, who gave them peace, and the gentle-hearted woman who tamed the wildness in his heart without ever trying to. Some said he became a lawman in another territory. Others claimed he found a little ranch by the river and lived out his days in quiet grace. But Clara knew the truth. He'd found what he was searching for, not in the land, but within himself. He had lived untouched by love, until the virgin whose kindness disarmed his warrior's soul